A broken veteran and his battle-scarred dog vanished into a frozen forest, mocked by townsfolk who swore he wouldn't last a single winter. They laughed as he built a lonely cabin with shaking hands, convinced the cold would finish what the war couldn't. Then the blizzard came, not as a whisper, but as a roaring beast, swallowing roads, burying lives, and testing every soul in its path. When desperate strangers followed a trail of smoke through white death and knocked on one final door, they discovered the truth too late. The man they dismissed was a combat-hardened survivor, and the dog at his side had already saved lives before. That night, the storm learned it had chosen the wrong cabin to challenge. Before we begin, if this story touches your heart, comment Amen, and please subscribe for more stories of courage, loyalty, and quiet heroes. Snow fell in slow, indifferent feathers over Silver Pine Forest, and the wind combed the pines like an old god searching for a name it had misplaced. The mountains stood watch, silent as judges, while winter sharpened its knives. Jack Miller returned to America the way a ship returns after a storm still afloat, still intact to the eye, yet carrying salt in every seam. He was 38. Broad-shouldered in that lean, worn way soldiers get when they stop eating for pleasure and start eating for function. His face had hard angles, a jaw that looked carved rather than grown, and cheekbones that caught the cold light like stone ledges. A short, dark beard shadowed his mouth, not for style but because some mornings the idea of grooming felt like negotiating with an enemy. His hair was brown with threads of gray at the temples. Too early, people would say, as if war politely waited for birthdays. His eyes were the kind of pale hazel that could look friendly from a distance and haunted up close, the color of autumn river water over rocks. When he spoke, his voice came out low and controlled, trimmed down to essentials, as if every extra word might attract something sharp from the dark. He wore a weathered brown coat that had seen too many nights, and beneath it a red and black plaid shirt, faded, familiar, stubbornly warm. The coat made him look like a man trying to pass as ordinary. The way he held himself revealed the lie. He carried no medals where strangers could see them. If he had trophies from the desert, they lived in the quiet place behind his ribs, clinking softly when he tried to breathe too deep. The only companion who walked close enough to touch him was Ranger, a German shepherd with the unmistakable build of a working dog, muscular without heaviness, athletic without vanity. Ranger was 6 years old, with a sable coat that darkened along his back like storm clouds gathering and lightened at the legs and chest into warmer tan, as if the sun had once tried to bless him and only managed a partial miracle. His ears stood alert and slightly scarred at the edges, the kind of small damage that told a story without giving away its ending. One eye was a shade darker than the other, a subtle difference most people missed until Ranger turned his head and fixed them with a stare that felt like a question. Are you safe, or are you trouble? His muzzle had begun to silver at the whiskers, not from age alone but from experience, sand, smoke, long nights, and the kind of vigilance that eats youth. Ranger moved with a soldier's economy, no wasted steps, no unnecessary noise, yet when he leaned into Jack's leg for half a second, there was tenderness in it, an almost human insistence that someone somewhere was still allowed to be held. They came back to a town that wanted simple stories. Cold Creek preferred its heroes clean, smiling, and available for parades. It liked veterans when they spoke about courage in tidy paragraphs and never mentioned the part where courage tasted like metal and loneliness. Jack didn't fit the town's appetite. He stepped into Murdoch's general store on a morning when the sky was the color of wet ash. The bell above the door chimed, bright and cheerful, like it hadn't gotten the memo that joy could be a cruel sound. Warm air, smelling of coffee and wood smoke, rolled over him. Jack paused just inside, letting his eyes map the room the way they always did. Exits, corners, reflections in glass. Ranger sat on command by his left boot, calm as a statue, tail resting, gaze scanning the floor and the faces without staring. A few heads turned, a few voices lowered. There was a certain small-town silence that wasn't respectful so much as curious. the silence of people watching a stranger who carried the wrong kind of weather inside him. Jack's posture stayed neutral, shoulders relaxed, hands visible, breathing steady. But inside his chest, something tight and old kept measuring distances, rehearsing outcomes. Hypervigilance, the doctors called it, as if naming the monster made it behave. To Jack it felt less like a condition and more like a second dog he couldn't leash, always circling, always warning, always ready to bite at shadows. Frank Murdoch stood behind the counter, a thick-armed man in his late 50s with a ruddy face and a mustache that made him look like he'd been born frowning. He wasn't cruel. He was practical, and practicality sometimes wore the mask of mockery when it didn't know how to handle pain. Frank's eyes flicked to Ranger with an uneasy admiration. Townsfolk trusted dogs more quickly than men. "You're stocked for hunting season?" Frank asked, tone casual, as if Jack were just another customer with a hobby. "Winter," Jack replied. One word. He set items on the counter with careful spacing. Salt, dried beans, flour, matches, a small hand-crank radio, a spool of wire, a bag of nails, and a new hatchet whose handle smelled sharply of fresh varnish. Frank's eyebrows rose at the quantity. "Going up to the old timberline?" someone muttered from near the coffee display. It was a man with a baseball cap and the kind of belly that suggested he'd never met a hardship he couldn't out-eat. His laugh was quick, soft, like a pebble tossed at a window. "That forest'll chew you up. Winter don't care who you are." Jack didn't look at him. He didn't have to. He could feel the man's gaze the way you can feel heat from a stove. Jack's silence wasn't pride, it was self-defense. In other places, other years, arguments had been the match that lit worse fires. He'd learned painfully that some people didn't want answers, they wanted a reaction. He wasn't feeding them. Ranger lifted his head slightly, ears angling toward the voice. Jack touched 2 fingers to the dog's collar, a quiet signal. "Not now." Ranger's tail made the smallest sweep of the floor, not submissive, not friendly, simply acknowledging the command. Frank rang up the supplies, then leaned in an inch, lowering his voice. "You got family in town?" Jack's throat tightened with a humorless, almost laugh. Family. The word had become a myth, like dragons spoken about more than seen. He shook his head once. "You got a place to stay?" Frank tried again, softer this time. Jack's gaze drifted toward the window, where snow had begun to fall more heavily, each flake tumbling like a slow, indecisive thought. "Working on it," he said. Frank looked at Ranger again. "That dog yours?" Jack's hand rested on Ranger's head for a moment, fingers pressing into thick fur that held warmth like stored sunlight. "He's my partner." Something in Frank's face shifted. Maybe he'd heard the word partner used that way before, in stories about police K9S or search and rescue teams, where loyalty had a job description. But the way Jack said it made it older than a job. It sounded like a vow. Frank nodded, not understanding, but respecting the gravity anyway. Outside, Cold Creek lay small and neat, tucked against the forest like a child leaning against a stern parent. Jack loaded the supplies into the bed of a weathered pickup whose paint had surrendered to time and weather. He moved methodically, strapping things down as if the world might test his knots. Ranger jumped into the passenger seat without being asked, turning once before settling. Disciplined, familiar. When Jack climbed in, his hands paused on the steering wheel for just a moment, knuckles whitening, as if the simple act of starting an engine required permission from the past. He drove away from town on a road that narrowed and roughened, traded pavement for packed dirt and ice. Pines rose on either side like dark pillars holding up the sky. The deeper he went, the less he heard of the human world. No radio chatter, no voices, no laughter that sounded like stones. Only the hush of snow, the whisper of wind, and the occasional snap of a branch under ice. The forest felt like a cathedral built for old gods' gods who didn't preach, only watched. Jack liked that. The silence wasn't empty here. It was honest. His reasons for leaving weren't complicated, but they were heavy. In town, noises came from all directions, a door slamming like a distant explosion, a dropped plate that sent his heart sprinting, a car backfiring that dragged the desert back into his mouth. At night, sleep arrived in fragments. When it did, it brought dreams that weren't dreams so much as reruns, faces without names, heat without fire, the feeling of counting seconds while praying time would hurry. In those dreams, Jack could smell dust and blood, and sometimes he'd wake with his fists clenched and Ranger's nose pressed against his cheek, steadying him like an anchor. The dog never judged him for breaking. The dog simply stayed. Silver Pine Forest had been a point on a map at first, a place where winter was ruthless enough to keep people away, and the trees were thick enough to hide him from curious eyes. Jack didn't want pity, didn't want gratitude, didn't want the ceremonial handshakes that came with a story people could digest. He wanted to become small again, small enough that the world couldn't ask him for anything. He wanted the kind of solitude that wasn't loneliness, but mercy. The chosen spot sat near a half-frozen creek where stones showed through the ice like knuckles. A small clearing opened beneath tall pines, protected from the harshest winds by a ridge to the north. Jack stepped out of the truck, boots crunching into snow, and inhaled air so cold it felt like it scoured him clean. Ranger leapt down and trotted the perimeter, nose low, reading the ground like a book written in scents. Deer, fox, old campfire ash, the faint trace of something larger farther off. Ranger's posture stayed alert but not tense. This wasn't the desert. The threats here had teeth and weather, not intent. Still, the dog treated the wilderness with respect, the way soldiers respect anything that can kill you without trying. Jack unloaded a tarp, a small canvas tent, and tools. He worked without hurry but without hesitation, hammering stakes, stringing a line, laying out the beginnings of a future like he was setting bones. Ranger returned and sat close, watching Jack's hands with quiet attention. From time to time the dog's ears flicked toward the trees, tracking distant movement, then returned to Jack as if to say, "I'll keep the world back while you build something that holds." As the pale afternoon slid toward dusk, Jack stood in the center of the clearing and looked around. In his mind he saw the cabin already simple, sturdy, nothing fancy. A one-room shelter of logs and stone, a place where fire could live without apology. He imagined a rough table, a cot, shelves for supplies, a corner where Ranger could curl up, warm and safe. He knew he'd need to move fast. The forest did not negotiate with late starters. But speed wasn't the only thing he had. He had patience. He had discipline. He had the stubborn, unglamorous will that had kept him alive when the world made no promises. He also had fear quiet, persistent. Not of dying. Death had visited him so often it felt like an acquaintance. He feared living, feared the long stretch of days where healing demanded that he feel things again. In the war, emotions were luxuries. Here, among trees and snow, they might become unavoidable. Sometimes Jack wondered if solitude would save him, or simply give the ghosts more room to speak. The thought nearly made him laugh. Imagine fearing silence more than gunfire. War turned a man into a riddle even he couldn't solve. Ranger padded over and pressed his shoulder against Jack's thigh, solid and warm. Jack exhaled. He reached down and scratched behind Ranger's ear, finding the place that made the dog's eyes soften. "We're here," Jack murmured, voice barely more than breath. The words weren't a celebration. They were a declaration to the part of himself that still expected the ground to shift. Night arrived quickly, dragging a curtain of dark across the trees. Jack built a small fire in a ring of stones, the flame flickering like a timid spirit learning it could live here. He boiled water, ate without tasting, and listened to the forest settle. Ranger lay close, facing outward, a living gate. Somewhere far away, a wolf called once lonely, not threatening. Jack felt a strange kinship with it. Two creatures speaking into winter, both of them stubbornly alive. Before crawling into the tent, Jack looked up at the stars. They glittered cold and indifferent, yet steady, like old sentinels who never blinked. He thought of Cold Creek, with its warm lights and easy gossip. He thought of the desert, with its burning days and nights that smelled like smoke. He thought of all the versions of himself that had existed, young, hopeful, certain, older, harder, silent. None of them had found peace yet. But in this clearing, with Ranger's steady breathing beside him and the promise of a cabin waiting to be built, Jack felt something unfamiliar move under his ribs. Not happiness, not safety, something smaller and more practical, possibility. He lay down, pulling his coat closer like armor made of cloth instead of steel, and Ranger curled against the tent wall, a warm guardian. Outside, the winter forest listened. Inside, the man who didn't want to be seen closed his eyes and, for the first time in a long time, allowed the darkness to pass without fighting it. This was only the beginning, just the first stake in frozen ground, the first ember in a long season, but it was the moment Jack Miller chose the forest over the noise and chose to build a life where no one could tell him what he was allowed to survive. Cold Creek wore winter like a habit rather than a threat, its streets swept and salted, its windows glowing with a confidence that came from being close enough to warmth to believe it would always be there. The town had a way of noticing newcomers without welcoming them, and Jack Miller felt that attention settle on his shoulders like an extra pack he hadn't agreed to carry. He moved through town with Ranger at his side, not hiding, not performing, simply existing, which in Cold Creek was its own kind of provocation. They talked about him where he couldn't help but hear at the gas pumps, by the coffee urn at Murdoch's, near the counter of the diner that smelled perpetually of bacon grease and burned toast. Jack didn't turn his head when voices dropped or rose. He'd learned long ago that curiosity could escalate into confrontation if you fed it. Ranger, on the other hand, noticed everything. The dog's ears tracked tone and rhythm more than words, and when laughter sharpened into mockery, his posture stiffened, weight shifting forward, a silent question asked and answered with a subtle pressure of Jack's fingers on his collar. Ray Bishop ran the gas station at the edge of town, a lean man in his 40s with a wind-burned face and a habit of speaking before thinking. He'd grown up in Cold Creek, lost a brother to a logging accident years back, and ever since then he carried a brittle humor that cracked easily into derision. "Saw that soldier fella again," Ray said one afternoon to anyone within earshot, leaning against a pump while snow ticked softly against his jacket. "Hauling wire and beans like he's going to outlast January up there. Forest'll teach him different." Ray laughed. A quick bark meant to sound wise. Harold Whitman heard him and snorted. Harold was in his late 60s, tall and spare, with a back bent not from age, so much as from stubborn years spent refusing help. His beard was white and uneven, trimmed by his own hand, and his eyes were a clear, piercing blue that missed very little. He'd been a volunteer firefighter once, then a county roadman, then nothing at all after his wife died, and the town slowly forgot how much it had leaned on him. Experience had carved lines deep into his face, and it had also carved a certain fatalism into his voice. "That land he's headed for," Harold said, staring past Ray toward the forested hills. "Chews men up when winter gets serious. I've seen it. Ain't pride, it's weather." There was no cruelty in his tone, only certainty, the most dangerous kind. Inside the diner, Sarah Collins wiped down a table with steady hands and an expression that suggested she'd learned how to listen without absorbing. She was in her early 30s, tall and willowy, with chestnut hair pulled into a loose braid that brushed the middle of her back. Her skin was pale in that northern way, dusted with freckles that showed more clearly in winter light. Sarah had grown up in Cold Creek and left twice, once for college, once for love, and returned both times when the outside world proved less forgiving than promised. The second return had been harder. The man she'd followed had broken something in her confidence she still kept mending, quietly, like a seam she didn't want anyone else to see. She noticed Jack and Ranger through the front window as they passed, the dog's calm gait, the man's careful distance from other people. There was something in the way Jack walked that made her pause, not fear but recognition, the sense of someone carrying a weather system inside his ribs. "Guy's crazy," muttered a regular at the counter, a broad man with thick fingers and a permanent flush, whose opinions were fueled by coffee and a need to feel informed. "Living alone up there. Won't last. Folks like that never do." Sarah didn't answer. She dried her hands and glanced again at the window, where Jack had already moved on. She'd learned the town's rhythms well enough to know when silence was safer than dissent, but the words stayed with her, an uncomfortable echo. Jack heard enough to understand the shape of the story being told about him. He didn't need names attached to it. It was the same narrative he'd worn before: outsider, fool, man courting disaster. In another life, another uniform, he might have corrected them, offered facts and probabilities, explained what training did to a person's sense of cold and hunger. But he'd learned the hard way that explanation often sounded like boasting to people who didn't want to learn. So he kept his mouth shut and his pace steady, letting the laughter pass through him like wind through branches. There were moments, though, when the noise got under his skin. At night, alone in the tent, the forest quiet pressing close, the words replayed with a clarity that startled him, not because he believed them, but because they reminded him how easily people dismissed what they didn't understand. He lay awake sometimes, staring at the dark, counting Ranger's breaths, feeling the old itch in his hands that came when he wanted to build something solid enough to defy opinion. The days shortened, and Jack split his time between the clearing and town. He came back for supplies he'd underestimated. Extra tarps, a heavier shovel, more nails, and each visit brought new commentary. The hardware store men made bets under their breath. The mail carrier shook her head sympathetically, as if Jack were a lost cause already. Jack nodded politely, paid cash, and left. Ranger stayed impeccably behaved, a silent rebuke to anyone expecting menace. Children watched him with open fascination, tugging at sleeves, asking parents if they could pet the dog. Most parents said no. Ranger didn't seem offended. He simply sat, eyes level, patient as stone. One afternoon, as Jack loaded lumber into the truck, Harold Whitman approached him without ceremony. Up close, the old man smelled faintly of smoke and engine oil, a scent that spoke of long winters survived by stubborn routines. "You hear what folks are saying," Harold said, not accusing, not curious, simply stating a fact. Jack secured the last strap and straightened. He met Harold's gaze without challenge. "I hear enough." Harold nodded, as if that answered something. "You ain't arguing." "Doesn't change the weather," Jack replied. His voice was calm, but there was steel under it, a quiet refusal to be pulled into someone else's script. Harold studied him a moment longer, then glanced at Ranger. "Dog looks like he's seen work." "He has," Jack said. "Forests don't care about work," Harold muttered. Then, after a pause, "But it respects preparation." He stepped back, conversation over, leaving behind a sentence that felt less like a warning and more like an assessment. That night, snow came harder, erasing footprints and softening edges. Jack and Ranger returned to the clearing under a sky heavy with promise. Jack worked by lantern light, setting the first real timbers into place, muscles burning in a way that felt honest. Each strike of the hammer drowned out a little more of the town's laughter. Ranger lay nearby, eyes tracking the circle of light, occasionally rising to investigate a sound before settling again. Jack's thoughts moved too, laying foundations. He remembered a night overseas when laughter had followed him then, as well nervous, brittle laughter after a mission gone wrong, men trying to convince themselves they were untouchable. He remembered how quickly that illusion shattered. The memory didn't hurt the way it used to, it sharpened him. People laughed when they needed to believe consequences were for other men. Jack had stopped believing that a long time ago. In town, Sarah closed the diner late, locking the door against the cold. She stood for a moment on the sidewalk, breath fogging, listening to the quiet. She thought of the man with the soldier's walk and the dog with the old eyes, and wondered how many versions of truth a small place could hold before it choked on its own certainty. She didn't know why she cared. Maybe it was simply easier to root for someone who wasn't asking to be saved. The laughter followed Jack like a shadow for weeks, thinning as winter deepened, replaced by a watchful curiosity. But for now, it still clung to him, a sound he carried back into the trees. Jack didn't mind. He had learned that ridicule was lighter than regret, easier to bear than the weight of staying where you didn't belong. He drove the last stake into frozen ground and stepped back, breath steady, Ranger's presence solid at his knee. The forest accepted the sound without comment. Jack did the same. Winter tightened its grip on Silver Pine Forest with deliberate patience, the kind that did not rush because it knew it would win eventually. Snow fell heavier now, layering the ground in clean white silence, and the cold sharpened every sound until the crack of an axe rang like a bell struck in a cathedral no one attended anymore. Jack Miller rose before dawn, not because he needed to, but because his body refused to forget old rhythms. Sleep still came in fragments, and when it released him, it did so abruptly, as if pushed. He dressed without ceremony, pulling on thick wool, his battered brown coat, the familiar red and black plaid shirt beneath it, and heavy gloves already stiff with dried blood and resin. His breath fogged in the half-light as he stepped outside the tent, Ranger rising instantly from the snow where he had slept, alert but calm, tail low, ears forward. Jack chose his materials the way he once chose routes through hostile ground. Deliberately, conservatively, with respect for what could go wrong. The trees he felled were old pines, straight-trunked and scarred by decades of wind. Their bark was rough, furrowed like the hands of men who had worked too long without rest. Each strike of the axe sent a jolt up Jack's arms, vibrations sinking into bone. His palms split open despite the gloves, thin lines of red blooming against the white, the cold preventing the blood from flowing freely, turning pain into a distant, manageable fact. He welcomed it more than he expected. This pain made sense. Ranger worked the perimeter without instruction, nose skimming snow, muscles coiled beneath his thick sable coat. The dog was built for endurance rather than speed, shoulders powerful, chest deep, legs clean and strong. At 6 years old, Ranger carried himself with the quiet authority of experience. He paused often, listening, his darker eye narrowing slightly when distant sounds drifted through the trees. He was not anxious. He was attentive, the difference carved by years of training and survival. When Jack rested, Ranger returned to sit close, offering his warmth without intrusion, a presence that asked nothing and promised everything. Jack laid the first logs with care, leveling them with stones scavenged from the half-frozen creek. The stones were rounded, stubborn, refusing to stack easily, and he had to test each one, turning it again and again until it settled with the subtle certainty of something finding its place. He built the foundation low and thick, understanding weight and balance the way only someone who had trusted structures with his life could. Every decision felt deliberate, every small success quietly satisfying. There was no audience here, no commentary, only the forest and the steady rhythm of work. As the days passed, Jack developed a routine that felt almost sacred. Morning meant cutting and hauling, breath steaming, muscles burning. Midday meant fitting stones, fingers numb, patience stretched thin and reforged with each correction. Evening meant fire, simple food, and silence deep enough to hear his own thoughts without them echoing into panic. In town, people measured time in hours and obligations. In the forest, Jack measured it in progress. One log placed, one wall rising, one night survived without the past clawing too hard at his ribs. His mind, freed from constant noise, began to wander in ways it had avoided for years. Sometimes memories surfaced uninvited. A sun-bleached road overseas, the weight of a rifle against his shoulder, the moment Ranger, then younger, leaner, had dragged him behind cover while dust and heat swallowed the sky. Those memories came without warning, sharp and vivid, but now they arrived without overwhelming him. He acknowledged them, breathed through them, returned to the work. Building required presence. The cabin demanded his full attention, and in giving it, he found relief. One afternoon, as Jack levered a heavy beam into place, the wind shifted, carrying with it a faint human sound voices, distant but unmistakable. Ranger froze, ears snapping forward. Jack stilled, listening. The sound faded, likely someone passing on the lower trail, but the interruption lingered. He realized then how completely the forest had claimed him. The idea of being watched again felt intrusive, almost wrong. He shook it off and returned to the beam, muscles trembling as he guided it into its notch. When it settled, solid and true, he exhaled a breath he hadn't known he was holding. The cabin began to take shape. Not grand, not impressive, but honest. 4 walls rising steadily, each log bearing the marks of his effort. Jack stepped back one evening and studied the structure in the failing light. It wasn't just shelter, it was evidence. Proof that his hands could still create instead of destroy, that discipline could still build instead of only endure. He felt something loosen inside him, a knot tied so long it had begun to feel permanent. Ranger sensed the shift. He wagged his tail more freely now, sweeping arcs that kicked up snow, his posture less guarded within the clearing. He slept closer to the cabin walls as they rose, as if recognizing the shape of home before it was complete. At night, when the wind howled and branches creaked under ice, Ranger positioned himself between Jack and the door, a living barricade that allowed Jack to close his eyes without scanning the dark. Jack's hands grew worse before they grew better. The cold reopened old cracks daily, the skin splitting, bleeding, healing just enough to split again. He wrapped them at night, massaged them with ointment, and ignored the sting when he worked. In another life, a medic would have scolded him. Here, the forest simply accepted the cost. Pain became part of the rhythm, another reminder that this work was real. Late one evening, after the fire had burned low, Jack sat on a log and stared into the embers. He thought about the man he had been before the war, younger, louder, quicker to trust. He wondered if that version of himself was gone or merely buried, like the stones beneath his cabin walls, waiting for weight to give them purpose. He didn't know the answer, and for once he didn't feel compelled to find it immediately. Survival had taught him that some questions earned patience. Snow fell through the night, heavy and relentless, and Jack woke to a world transformed. The cabin walls stood firm beneath the burden, logs darkened with moisture but unbowed. Jack brushed snow from the beams and felt a surge of quiet pride. This was what progress looked like here. Not applause, not approval, just resilience. Ranger bounded through the drifts, shaking snow from his coat, eyes bright, alive in a way that reminded Jack that joy didn't always need permission. As winter deepened, Jack realized something subtle but profound. The work was changing him, not erasing the past, not pretending it hadn't happened, but giving it a place to rest. Each log fitted into another felt like a thought finally allowed to settle. Each stone placed was a memory acknowledged and set down instead of carried. He was not becoming someone new. He was becoming whole. One morning, with frost clinging thickly to the trees, Jack drove the final stake into the ground that marked the cabin's outline. He stood there for a long moment, breath steady, Ranger at his side, and allowed himself a rare, fleeting smile. It wasn't happiness exactly. It was alignment. The feeling of standing where you were meant to stand, doing the work you were meant to do, with no one watching and no one judging. That night, as the fire crackled and Ranger slept with his head on Jack's boot, Jack acknowledged a truth he hadn't spoken aloud before. This cabin was more than shelter from the cold. It was an act of defiance against everything that had tried to reduce him to silence or memory. It was his answer to the laughter, to the doubt, to the war that had taken so much and offered nothing back. And though the walls were still unfinished and winter far from done, Jack knew this much with certainty. He was no longer just surviving. He was rebuilding himself, log by log, breath by breath, exactly where he needed to be. The storm arrived without ceremony, sliding down from the northern ridges like a verdict that had already been written. Snow began as a whisper, then thickened into sheets, and the wind followed soon after, threading itself through the forest with a voice that sounded uncomfortably like memory. Jack Miller sensed it before the sky fully closed. His body, trained by years of reading terrain and danger, tightened hours ahead of the first real gust. The air felt brittle, charged, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Ranger picked up on it too. The dog paced the clearing with unusual insistence, stopping often to lift his muzzle and test the wind, ears rotating like radar dishes. His sable coat bristled slightly, not from fear, but readiness. By mid-afternoon, the temperature dropped hard. Jack's breath came out in thick clouds as he worked faster than planned, securing loose boards, reinforcing the half-finished roof with extra bracing. The cabin stood only partially enclosed, 3 walls complete, the 4th rising but unfinished, gaps still visible between logs. Snow forced its way through those spaces, fine and needling, stinging Jack's cracked hands. He welcomed the urgency. Urgency focused him. The wind strengthened, pushing through the pines in long, violent breaths. Branches groaned overhead, shedding clumps of snow that hit the ground with dull thuds. Jack's mind flickered backward without permission to nights overseas when the wind carried sand instead of snow, when sound alone could mean survival or death. His jaw tightened. He shook the memory loose and returned to the present, hammer ringing, muscles burning. Ranger stayed close, never underfoot, but always within reach. When Jack dropped a tool, Ranger retrieved it without being asked, gripping the wooden handle carefully between his teeth. At 6 years old, the dog moved with a balance of strength and restraint, his dark eyes focused, intelligent, and deeply aware of Jack's state. Ranger had learned long ago that storms did not always come from the sky. As daylight failed, the storm crossed a threshold. Snow no longer fell. It attacked. Visibility shrank to a few yards, the world reduced to swirling white and dark vertical lines of trees. Jack abandoned plans of further building and focused instead on survival. He hauled firewood inside, stacking it against the stone base of the wall, each log thudding down like punctuation. He sealed the largest gaps with canvas and spare boards, knowing it wouldn't be perfect, only enough. Enough was often the difference. The first true gust hit just as Jack struck a match. The cabin shuddered, a deep, unsettling vibration that traveled through the unfinished structure and into his bones. Ranger snapped to attention, a low growl rolling from his chest, not aggressive but alert. Jack crouched and placed a hand on the dog's shoulder, fingers digging into thick fur. "Easy," he murmured, voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. The word wasn't just for Ranger. Fire caught, weak at first, then stronger. Flames licked upward, casting erratic shadows across raw wood and stone. The heat was minimal but precious, something tangible to fight back with. Jack fed the fire carefully, rationing instinctively, calculating burn time the way he once calculated ammunition. Outside, the wind screamed. It found the gaps he hadn't closed, drove snow through them like thrown sand. The sound crawled under Jack's skin. Night fell completely, and with it came the worst of the storm. The temperature plummeted further, the cold no longer a sharp edge, but a weight pressing inward from all sides. Jack's fingers numbed despite the fire. His ears rang with the constant roar, a sound so loud it erased the concept of silence. He crouched by the fire, Ranger pressed tight against his leg, the dog's body heat bleeding through layers of fabric, grounding him in the present. There was a moment brief, dangerous, when Jack's breathing hitched. The wind rose in pitch, and for a split second it became something else entirely. Rotor wash, shouted commands, the thud of boots on metal. His vision tunneled. The cabin wavered. Ranger reacted instantly, lifting his head and placing his muzzle firmly against Jack's chest, exhaling slowly, deliberately. The dog's breath was warm, real, not memory. Jack forced himself to match it. In, out, counted breaths. The storm outside continued its assault, indifferent to the battle happening inside one man's chest. But Jack did not break. He stayed. He fed the fire. He anchored himself to the dog and the cabin and the moment, letting the past howl itself hoarse without answering. Hours passed that way, measured only by the fire's hunger and the ache in Jack's muscles. At some point near dawn, exhaustion claimed him. He didn't fight it. He dragged his bedroll closer to the fire, boots still on, coat wrapped tight, and lay down with Ranger curled against his side, the dog's back a solid, reassuring presence. Jack's hand rested unconsciously in the thick fur at Ranger's neck, fingers curled as if holding a lifeline. Sleep came, not the fractured, watchful doze he was used to, but something deeper. There were no dreams of desert heat or screaming metal, no faces without names, only darkness and the steady rise and fall of Ranger's breathing. The storm battered the cabin all night, testing joints and seams, but the structure held. Logs flexed, stones stayed locked. The cabin did what it was meant to do, stand between a man and the elements. Morning arrived quietly, almost apologetically. The wind faded to a low moan, then silence so complete it rang. Jack woke slowly, confused for a moment by the absence of threat. He sat up, joints stiff, and listened. Nothing but the soft crackle of dying embers and Ranger's sigh as he stretched. Jack realized then that he had slept through the night. Truly slept. The knowledge hit him harder than the storm had. He stood and pushed open the makeshift door. The world beyond had been erased and rewritten. Snow lay deep and untouched, sculpted into drifts that swallowed familiar shapes. The trees stood bowed, heavy with white, transformed into ancient statues. The cabin rose from it all, imperfect but intact, a stubborn fact against the clean devastation. Jack let out a breath that turned into something close to a laugh. Not joy, relief. The storm had come early, brutal and unannounced, and he had endured it. The cabin had endured it. He looked down at Ranger, who sat beside him, tail thumping once against the packed snow, eyes bright and steady. "That was the first one," Jack said quietly, voice rough but calm. Ranger met his gaze, unblinking, as if acknowledging a shared truth. There would be more storms, worse ones. But something fundamental had shifted. The forest had tested him and found him unbroken. Jack closed the door against the cold and turned back toward the fire, already planning repairs, reinforcements, improvements. Survival was no longer theoretical. It was real, earned, and quietly proven. And for the first time since returning home, Jack felt something unfamiliar settle into his bones. Not peace, exactly, but confidence. The kind forged only by standing through a storm and waking up afterward. The second storm did not announce itself the way the first had. It arrived like a closing fist. Snow fell straight down at first, thick and heavy, smothering sound. Then the wind turned savage, ripping sideways through silver pine forest with a force that bent the tall pines until they groaned like injured animals. The world shrank to white chaos, and the line between ground and sky disappeared completely. Jack Miller knew this storm was different the moment he stepped outside to check the chimney. The cold cut deeper, sharper, as if winter had finally decided to show its full teeth. His beard crusted with ice almost instantly, breath burning his lungs. Ranger followed him without command, pressing close to Jack's leg, body tense but controlled. The dog's dark eye kept flicking toward the tree line, instincts whispering things Jack could not yet hear. Inside the cabin, the fire burned steadily. Jack had learned from the first storm. He fed it early, rationed carefully, and kept the chimney drawing clean. Smoke rose in a thin, stubborn column above the cabin, dark against the white sky. Jack didn't think about it as a signal. He thought about it as survival. It was Ranger who saw them first. The dog froze mid-step, ears snapping forward, body angling toward the storm. Jack followed his gaze, squinting through blowing snow. At first, there was nothing. Just movement that could have been shadow or drift. Then it moved again, wrong for the wind, staggered, human. Jack's chest tightened. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat, rifle slung out of habit more than intent, and stepped back into the storm. Ranger surged ahead a few steps, then checked himself, looking back to Jack for confirmation. Jack nodded once. "Go." The figures emerged slowly, painfully, as if the storm were trying to swallow them whole. The first was a woman, tall but hunched against the wind, one arm wrapped around a child bundled so heavily he looked more like a package than a boy. Her other arm flailed occasionally for balance. She wore a Forest Service jacket buried beneath snow and ice, the green fabric barely visible. Her face was raw with cold, skin pale and cracked, dark hair plastered to her cheeks in frozen strands. Her eyes, sharp even through exhaustion, locked onto the cabin like a lifeline. Behind her, farther back, the storm moved again, but Jack focused on what was in front of him. He reached them in seconds, grabbing the woman by the shoulder. She nearly collapsed at the contact, legs trembling. "Inside," Jack said, voice cutting cleanly through the wind. It wasn't loud, but it was absolute. The woman tried to speak and failed, lips blue, jaw chattering violently. The boy in her arms made a weak sound, more breath than voice. Ranger pressed against the boy's dangling boots, adding his warmth instinctively, tail stiff, eyes intent. Jack half lifted, half guided them back to the cabin. The door slammed shut behind them, cutting off the howl of the storm like a blade. Warmth rushed in waves. The woman sagged to her knees, clutching the boy tighter. Jack knelt immediately, checking the child with quick, practiced hands. The boy Noah, Jack would soon learn, was around 7 years old, thin beneath the layers, face pale and pinched with cold. His eyelashes were rimmed with frost, lips trembling. He was conscious, eyes unfocused, but open. The woman forced herself upright, swaying. She was in her mid-30s, lean and strong beneath the exhaustion, the kind of build shaped by long days outdoors rather than a gym. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse but controlled. "Emily Carter," she said. "Forest Ranger." Her jaw set as if the title mattered, as if holding on to it kept her standing. Jack nodded once. Jack. No last name. He didn't offer it. "Sit by the fire." Emily lowered herself carefully, shifting Noah so his back faced the flames. Ranger lay down immediately on the boy's other side, pressing close, radiating heat through thick fur. Noah's eyes flicked to the dog, lingering. His shaking eased slightly. Emily watched Ranger with something like relief and disbelief. "Good dog," she whispered, reaching out but stopping short, unsure. Ranger glanced at Jack. Jack nodded. Ranger didn't move away. Jack worked efficiently. Blankets, dry socks, warm water. He checked Emily's hands, numb but intact, frost-bitten skin whitening at the fingertips. He wrapped them without comment. He moved with a calm that came from muscle memory, not thought. Rescue mode. The war had taken many things from him, but it hadn't taken this. Once the immediate danger eased, Emily finally slumped back against the wall. Up close, Jack saw the strain etched into her face, fine lines from squinting into sun and snow, a scar cutting through one eyebrow, pale against weathered skin. Her dark hair, once tied neatly, now hung loose and tangled, streaked with ice. She looked like someone who had spent her life walking toward danger instead of away from it. "We lost the trail," she said quietly, staring at the fire. "Whiteout hit fast. I thought I could reach the station before dark." She swallowed. "That was my mistake." Jack didn't contradict her. He had learned that guilt didn't need encouragement. "You saw the smoke," he said instead. At his name, the boy stirred. His eyes focused more clearly now, settling on Ranger. "Is he real?" Noah asked, voice small but steady. Ranger huffed softly and nudged Noah's knee with his nose. Noah let out a breath that might have been a laugh. He reached out and buried his fingers in Ranger's fur, clinging. Ranger accepted it without protest, eyes lifting briefly to Jack as if to say, "I've got this one." Jack watched the exchange with something tight in his throat. He turned away before Emily could notice. The storm battered the cabin relentlessly through the night. Snow piled against the walls, wind shrieked through the chimney, but the fire held. Jack stayed awake, feeding it, checking on Emily and Noah, listening to the forest try and fail to break through. Emily dozed fitfully, boots off, hair drying slowly in the warmth. Noah slept more deeply, curled against Ranger, one hand still tangled in fur. At some point, Emily woke and sat up, eyes immediately alert. "How long?" she asked. "Until it breaks," Jack replied. "Could be days." She studied him in the firelight, the scars at his knuckles, The way he moved, the stillness. "You're military," she said softly. It wasn't a question. Jack nodded once. "That explains the cabin," she said, glancing around. "And the dog." Jack said nothing. Outside, the storm raged on, uncaring. Inside, 3 lives settled into fragile safety, bound by circumstance and smoke rising stubbornly into a white, merciless sky. Jack sat back against the wall, rifle within reach but untouched, Ranger's steady presence anchoring the room. He felt the old instinct settle fully into place. Not fear, not rage, but purpose. The storm could do its worst. Tonight, it would not take these people. The storm did not loosen its grip after the first night. It settled in, patient and punishing, as if determined to test every promise Jack Miller had made to himself when he chose the forest over the town. By morning, the cabin was half buried. Snow pressed tight against the walls like a living thing, and the wind never truly stopped. It only shifted pitch, rising and falling like breath from a massive, unseen chest. Jack woke before the others, the old instinct dragging him up while the fire still glowed red at its heart. His body catalogued the room automatically. Emily asleep against the wall, her ranger jacket draped over her like armor she refused to remove. Noah cocooned in blankets, one small hand still threaded into Ranger's fur, Ranger alert even in rest, ears twitching, breath steady. Jack fed the fire, listening to the snap and hiss, counting supplies in his head with the same ruthless honesty he once reserved for ammo checks. 3 days, maybe 4, if rationed carefully. Enough if nothing went wrong. Enough if he didn't make mistakes. Emily woke not long after, pushing herself upright with a wince. In the firelight, her features looked sharper, fatigue stripping away any softness the storm hadn't already taken. She moved like someone accustomed to discomfort. Tall and lean, muscles wired from years of carrying packs and responsibility through rough terrain. Her dark hair, freed from its tie, fell in a heavy curtain around her shoulders, drying unevenly. She had a habit of scanning corners when she woke, eyes quick and assessing, as if danger were a language she spoke fluently. "Still bad?" she asked quietly. "Worse before it's better," Jack replied. He handed her a tin cup of warmed water. Their eyes met briefly, recognition without explanation. She nodded and drank, jaw tight against the cold and the fear she refused to voice. Noah stirred as Ranger shifted, the dog pressing closer as the boys shivering threatened to return. Ranger's body was a furnace, heat radiating through dense fur, his posture careful, protective. He was gentle with Noah in a way that surprised even Jack. 40 pounds of disciplined strength softened into patience. Noah's cheeks had regained a hint of color, his breathing deeper now. When he opened his eyes, he smiled faintly at Ranger and then at Jack. "Is the storm gone?" "Not yet," Jack said, "but it will be." He didn't say when. Soldiers learned not to promise timelines they couldn't enforce. They settled into a rhythm that would carry them through the days. Jack divided food into precise portions, explaining without condescension why each choice mattered. Emily listened, absorbing details, offering suggestions that proved her competence. How to layer insulation against the windward wall, how to bank snow to seal drafts without smothering airflow. She moved with purpose despite the fatigue, helping where she could, steadying Noah when his fear spiked, checking Ranger's pause for ice buildup. Jack noticed her hands, scarred in small places, nails short, skin weathered but strong. A woman who had chosen her work knowing it would demand more than it gave. The second night was the worst. The wind screamed through the chimney in violent bursts, rattling the stones, and the cold pressed so hard it seemed to seep through bone. Jack's mind flickered dangerously close to old places, nights under foreign stars, the sound of incoming trouble carried on air. He felt his pulse climb, the familiar edge of a response honed by years of survival. He caught it early, grounded himself in action. He checked seals, fed the fire, adjusted the stack of wood. Purpose narrowed his world to what he could control. Emily watched him work with quiet attention. "You've done this before," she said, not accusing, not prying. "Different storms," Jack answered. She studied his face, the hard lines, the trimmed beard that hid nothing of the scars beneath, the eyes that missed nothing. "You don't stop moving," she observed. Jack shrugged. "Keeps people alive." He didn't add that it also kept the ghosts at bay. On the third day, the radio crackled to life, startling them all. Jack froze, then moved to it, careful, deliberate. Static hissed, then a voice punched through, strained but human. "Carter, if you can hear this, Emily Carter, respond." Emily surged forward, relief flashing across her face before discipline reined it in. She took the radio, fingers steady despite the tremor in her shoulders. "Carter here," she said. "We're sheltered. Coordinates compromised by storm, but we're alive." The voice on the other end belonged to Deputy Mark Halverson, a stocky man in his early 40s with a gravelly tone and the weary patience of someone who had spent too many winters pulling people out of trouble. He spoke in clipped phrases, conserving battery and hope in equal measure. "Roads are gone. Teams grounded. Earliest push is after the front breaks. Stay put." "Copy," Emily replied. She glanced at Jack, gratitude unspoken but heavy. "We'll hold." When the radio died again, the cabin felt smaller, the silence louder. Noah leaned into Ranger, who shifted to accommodate him, chin resting lightly on the boy's shoulder. Jack sat back against the wall, rifle across his knees, not as a threat, but as an old habit that made his hands remember calm. He realized then that he felt exactly as he had before missions. Not fear, not excitement, but clarity. The storm was the enemy, time the terrain, and the objective simple: keep them alive. The third night broke something open inside him. As the wind finally began to weaken, Jack allowed himself to sit still, truly still, while Emily slept and Noah dreamed, murmuring once in his sleep before Ranger's steady warmth settled him again. Jack stared into the fire and understood, with a quiet certainty that felt like relief, that he had never stopped being a soldier. He had only changed who he fought for. No orders, no flags, just the lives in this room, the breath in their chests, the fragile promise of morning. When dawn came, it did so gently, light filtering through a world scoured clean. The storm retreated, leaving behind a silence that felt earned. Jack opened the door and stepped into air that bit but did not attack. Snow lay deep and brilliant. The forest bowed and humbled. Emily joined him, pulling her jacket tight, eyes shining as she took it in. "You saved us," she said simply. Jack shook his head. "We saved each other." He glanced back inside at Noah and Ranger, the boy's hand still anchored in fur. "That's how it works." He turned back to the cabin, already planning the next step's repairs, reinforcement, readiness. The soldier had returned to the fight, not to destroy, but to defend. And for the first time since coming home, Jack felt no conflict in that truth. The rescue team arrived just after noon, their snowshoes creaking softly against a crusted world that still smelled of storm. They came in a staggered line through the trees, bright jackets cutting against the white, breath rising in steady clouds. At the front was Deputy Mark Halverson, broad-shouldered and red-faced from the cold, his beard rimmed with ice, eyes scanning the terrain with practiced caution. Behind him followed 2 volunteer medics and a pair of county search and rescue men, younger, leaner, carrying sleds and packs heavy with equipment and relief. They stopped short when they saw the cabin. It did not look like something that should have survived what the forest had thrown at it. Snow banked nearly to the lower logs, drifts pressed tight along the walls, the chimney standing dark and stubborn against the sky. Smoke still curled upward in a thin, determined line. Halverson exhaled slowly. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. Jack Miller stepped outside before they could call out, Ranger at his side, posture relaxed but alert. Jack looked older in the daylight, exhaustion etched into his face, beard thicker now, eyes shadowed but clear. He raised a hand in greeting, a small, economical gesture. Ranger stood squarely beside him, calm, assessing, tail low and steady. Emily followed, one arm around Noah's shoulders. She looked transformed, still tired, still weathered, but upright, composed, Ranger green visible beneath the snow-crusted jacket. Noah leaned into her, but his eyes were bright now, cheeks flushed with warmth and life. He smiled when he saw the dog team members kneel instinctively toward Ranger, admiration lighting their faces. "You kept them alive," Halverson said, stepping forward. His voice carried something different now, respect stripped of formality. He looked from Emily to Noah, then back to Jack. "All of them." Jack shook his head once. "They did their part." He glanced at Emily and the boy. "We held together." The medics moved quickly, checking vitals, wrapping Noah in additional insulation, testing Emily's fingers and toes. Minor frostnip, dehydration, exhaustion, but alive. All alive. One of the younger rescuers, a man named Chris Lowell with wind-burned cheeks and earnest eyes, crouched near the cabin wall, running a gloved hand along the stonework. "This held," he said softly. Disbelief threaded through his words. "In that storm." Jack watched him without comment. He had built the cabin for solitude, not for testimony. News traveled faster than the rescue team. By the time the sleds turned back toward town with Emily and Noah bundled safely aboard, the story had already grown legs. Smoke seen miles away, a ranger and a child saved, a lone veteran and his dog holding a line against the worst storm in years. The forest had released them, and the town listened. Cold Creek received them with a different silence than before. This one was careful, almost reverent. People gathered near the firehouse, hats pulled low, breath held as Emily stepped down from the sled, Noah clutching Ranger's fur until Jack gently guided the dog back. Applause came hesitantly at first, then stronger, awkward, and sincere. Jack stood off to the side, hands in his coat pockets, shoulders slightly hunched as if trying to make himself smaller. He was not built for crowds. Sarah Collins watched from the diner doorway, her apron forgotten in her hands. In the winter light, her features looked softer than Jack remembered, tall and slender. Chestnut hair tucked beneath a knit cap, pale skin flushed pink from the cold. Her eyes followed Jack, curiosity giving way to something warmer. She remembered the laughter, the dismissive words, and felt a pinch of shame. When Jack's gaze flicked briefly toward her, she offered a small nod, a silent apology. Jack returned it, equally small, equally quiet. Inside the firehouse, coffee was poured, questions asked. Halverson clapped Jack on the shoulder with the kind of familiarity reserved for men who had shared something dangerous. "Town owes you," he said. "We'd like you closer in. Roads, shelter, steady work. We could use someone with your skills." Frank Murdoch was there too, hat in hand, mustache twitching as he cleared his throat. "Hardware stores always needin' help," he offered gruffly. "Partner even." Others followed. A contractor spoke of building projects come spring. A councilman, slick-haired, over-eager mentioned recognition, maybe a commendation. Words piled up like gifts Jack hadn't asked for. He listened politely, a faint smile touching his mouth but never reaching his eyes. "I appreciate it," Jack said finally, voice steady. "Truly." He glanced toward the windows, beyond which the forest waited, unchanged. "But I'm where I need to be." There was a pause, heavy and thoughtful. Emily, standing nearby with Noah's hand in hers, studied Jack's face. She understood something then, not stubbornness, not pride, but alignment. The forest was not his escape. It was his answer. "You're always welcome," Halverson said at last. It wasn't a negotiation. It was an acknowledgement. Jack left town before dusk, Ranger trotting easily beside him, the road narrowing until houses gave way to trees. The forest greeted them without ceremony. Snow still clung to branches, the air sharp and clean. Back at the cabin, Jack set about repairs, reinforcing seams, stacking fresh wood. Ranger patrolled the perimeter with renewed purpose, stopping now and then to sniff where rescue teams had passed, then returning to his post. As night fell, Jack sat by the fire and considered the change he'd felt in town. Not adoration, not absolution, but something quieter. Respect earned, not demanded. He hadn't sought it, but he accepted it without resentment. People learned at their own pace. Sometimes it took a storm to teach them where strength lived. He stepped outside once more and looked toward the faint glow that marked Cold Creek in the distance. For the first time, it did not feel like a place he was running from. It felt like a neighbor close enough to matter, far enough to breathe. Jack turned back to the cabin, Ranger's steady presence at his heel, and closed the door against the cold. The town had changed its mind. Jack had not changed his. And in that balance, something like peace took root. Winter did not leave Silver Pine Forest gently. It lingered, testing edges, returning in smaller storms like reminders rather than threats, as if the mountains wanted to be certain the lesson had been learned. Jack Miller stayed. He did not mark the decision as bravery or stubbornness. It simply felt correct, the way standing straight feels correct after years of carrying too much weight on one side. The cabin changed slowly after the rescue, not in shape alone, but in purpose. Jack reinforced the walls, added a proper door, widened the hearth so the fire could breathe more easily. He extended the structure outward with a lean-to that could shelter a lost hiker or a ranger caught by weather. Each beam was measured twice, each stone chosen with care. The work was quieter now, less driven by urgency, more by intention. Ranger supervised with solemn dedication, patrolling the clearing, ears alert, tail relaxed. At 6 years old, he had the confidence of a dog who knew his place in the world and guarded it well. His coat thickened further as winter deepened, sable dark against the snow, his eyes bright and watchful. Emily Carter became a familiar presence on the narrow trail that led to the cabin. She came first with supplies, medical kits, extra radio batteries, weather updates, and later with nothing more than coffee and conversation. In the clearer light of calmer days, Jack noticed details he hadn't before. The way Emily stood with her weight balanced, ready to move. The scar above her eyebrow that hinted at old risks taken without regret. The steadiness of her voice, even when she laughed. She was tall and lean, her dark hair often pulled back in a practical knot, her skin weathered but warm beneath the chill. Emily did not pry into Jack's past, and Jack did not ask about hers. Respect settled between them naturally, like snow finding level ground. Noah visited when roads allowed, bundled into layers that made him look rounder than he was, cheeks flushed with cold and excitement. He talked constantly now, the quiet fear that had once muted him replaced by curiosity. To Noah, Ranger was not just a dog. He was a hero. The boy followed him around the clearing, asking endless questions, mimicking Ranger's alert stance, laughing when the dog finally tolerated a clumsy hug. Ranger accepted the attention with dignified patience, allowing Noah to lean against him, to whisper secrets into his fur. Jack watched those moments with a strange, gentle ache, an emotion that surprised him with its softness. Word spread beyond Cold Creek. A pair of snowmobilers caught in a whiteout found the smoke and knocked on Jack's door one evening, faces pale, hands shaking. An elderly man from a neighboring county, stubborn and proud, limped in with frost-bitten toes and an apology he insisted on delivering before accepting help. Jack took them all in without ceremony. He offered warmth, food, quiet. He did not ask questions that didn't need answers. The cabin became what it was meant to be. Not a fortress against the world, but a shelter within it. Sarah Collins came one afternoon near the end of winter, hiking the last stretch when the road gave out. She looked different outside the diner, taller somehow, the forest lending her a seriousness she rarely wore in town. Her chestnut hair was braided tightly against the cold, her pale skin flushed from the climb. She carried a basket of bread and canned goods, an offering more than a gift. "Figured you might need these," she said, voice careful, honest. Jack thanked her and made coffee. They spoke of simple things, the weather, the quiet, how the forest changed sound. Sarah admitted, after a pause, that she'd been wrong about him. Jack shrugged, not dismissive, just finished with the subject. Ranger lay at their feet, content, the fire cracking softly behind them. Sarah left before dusk, lighter somehow, as if delivering the bread had eased something she'd been carrying. As the weeks passed, Jack noticed a shift inside himself. The past still existed, it always would, but it no longer dictated the shape of his days. He slept through most nights now, waking to the forest rather than to memory. When thoughts of the war came, they no longer arrived as ambushes. They came like visitors, unwelcome sometimes, but manageable. Jack had learned that healing was not forgetting. It was learning where to place the weight. One evening, after Emily and Noah had gone, Jack sat alone by the fire with Ranger's head resting on his knee. He thought about the man he had been when he arrived, silent, coiled, convinced that solitude was the only way to survive. He understood now that solitude had been the beginning, not the end. The forest had stripped him down, yes, but it had also given him room to rebuild. Outside, snow fell softly, no longer threatening, just present. The cabin stood firm, smoke rising steadily into the dark. It was not impressive by any official measure. There were no plaques, no names carved into stone, but it had saved lives. It had held warmth against the cold and fear against the night. Jack rested his hand on Ranger's neck and felt the steady pulse there, a reminder of loyalty earned and returned. This was home, not because it erased pain, but because it gave pain somewhere to rest. Jack had stopped running. He had turned what once haunted him into something that sheltered others, and in that quiet transformation, winter loosened its grip, just enough to let spring dream of returning. In the end, this was never just a story about a veteran, a dog, or a cabin standing in the snow. It was a reminder that miracles rarely arrive as thunder and light. Most of the time they come quietly through steady hands that refuse to give up, through loyalty that does not ask questions, through a door that opens when the storm should have won. Some might call it luck that the smoke was seen in time. Others might call it skill, preparation, or coincidence. But there is another truth many of us recognize in our hearts. God often works through ordinary people who simply choose to do the right thing, even when no one is watching. A fire kept burning. A door was opened. Lives were spared. That is how grace often moves, unannounced, humble, and powerful. In our own lives, we all face winters, seasons of loss, loneliness, fear, or exhaustion where the wind seems too strong and the road disappears. This story reminds us that faith is not the absence of storms, but the decision to keep building, keep loving, and keep the fire alive anyway. And sometimes God uses our pain to become shelter for someone else. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Comment, Amen, if you believe that God still works miracles in quiet ways. And subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, courage, and the unseen hands that guide us through the storm. May God bless you, protect you, and keep you warm in every season of your life. May He turn your struggles into strength, your wounds into wisdom, and your home, wherever it is, into a place of peace. Amen.